Good afternoon and welcome to our final keynote session for Planet Native 2022. My name is Stacia Stelk and I'm the Executive Director of Deep Roots. I am thrilled with this year's conference and I hope that you are too. This morning, I would like to thank the Deep Roots Board of Directors for their role in and support of Planet Native. Dave Gale, our chair, Jason Jensen, vice chair, Tom Jacobs, treasurer, Margot Farnsworth, secretary, Bob Berkebile, Kathy Gates, our founder, Jenna Miller, Dr. Marion Pearson, Kristen Riot, Eric Chance, and Stephen Van Ryn. To the Deep Roots Board, thank you for your counsel, vision, and can-do attitude that got us here today. Finally, this conference is also made possible by an incredible team at Deep Roots, Jahida Aguilar, Miller Zeiders, and of course, our Planet Native hero, Tammy Thompson. And I would like to give a special shout out to Amy Humphrey Hayes, who has practically been a Deep Roots staff person in her assistance with Planet Native. Amy, every Planet Native, I look forward to working with you. In this closing session, I will once again thank our sponsors, without whom we could not bring you Planet Native 2022. Our platinum sponsor, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, and our gold sponsors, DCA Colonial Gardens and the Miller Hammond Charitable Fund. Special thanks to our silver sponsors, Evergy Green Team, Gale Hart Communities, Montage Liberty, Habitat Architects, the Missouri Department of Conservation, or Conversation, depending on what mood you're in, the Missouri Wildflower Nursery, and Ripple Glass. And finally, thank you to our bronze sponsors, Forest Keeling Nursery, Izell Native Plants, the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks, KC Can Compost, the Mark Water Quality Public Education Committee, Print Forest, Red River Valley Design, So Wild Natives, Vireo, and Wild Honey Farms. Yesterday, I mistakenly read an incorrect list of sponsors, and for that reason, I'd like to give a special shout out to those I missed, Ripple Glass and Izell Native Plants. Thank you for your support. In our final webinar of the conference, I want to give one last reminder to ask questions and make comments on the right side of the screen with the chat feature. Today's keynote is brought to you by our platinum sponsor, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. Nan and Paul became the new owners of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn in 2019, just before our first Planet Native conference. Nan and Paul have a vision for all the ways in which native plants enhance our landscapes, whether it's a wildflower meadow on a large lot or a conventional design relying on native plants. They recognize the regenerative importance of these species. Of course, this audience is aware of the beauty of native plants and their ecosystem services. Nan and Paul see Kansas City, a city surrounded by the plains, as a community where native plant landscapes are the norm and not the exception. And through their business, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, they will help make that happen. And yes, they know that the book for which their business is named features an invasive tree of heaven. This makes us appreciate the irony that Nan and Paul's business, however, is focused on regenerative urban landscaping. Nina Marie Lister is our closing keynote speaker, discussing challenging law and order, barriers, bylaws, and the biophilic city. Nina Marie is a professor and graduate director of the School of Urban and Regional Planning at Riverson University and a visiting professor of landscape architecture at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. A registered professional planner trained in ecology, environmental science, and landscape planning, Professor Lister's focuses on the relationship between landscape infrastructure, biodiversity, and ecological processes. She is specifically interested in ecological design for resilience, health, and well-being. Lister holds the 2021 to 22 Margulies National Design for Living Prize and is a senior fellow at Massey College in Toronto. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. How exciting to be among plants people. I'm going to share my screen with you and hope very much that this will work the way we want it to. And just let me know when you have me all set. How's that? Okay, so I really enjoy the opportunity to be among people and plants today, and you will notice no Elianthus or Tree of Heaven in my yard that I'm about to show, I promise. There are, however, some sumac. I hope those of you who are excited to take note of the images will ask me some questions about this afterwards. I'm with you today to talk about challenging the norms that are very much part of your conference, but specifically, in the words of the architecture critic in our national newspaper here in Canada, law and order, barriers, bylaws, and the biophilic city. I'm at Toronto Metropolitan University, a university that has recently changed its name, and I would like to share with you an acknowledgement and gratitude of the work that has happened at this university, made possible by the land we share. If you'll indulge me, I'll tell you a story about this. This is the story of the dish with one spoon territory. Toronto Metropolitan University and my research lab, the Ecological Design Lab, are in Toronto, also known as Toronto, which is in this territory. The dish with one spoon territory is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee peoples that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. As a settler person, it's important that I tell you I acknowledge and honor my responsibilities under this treaty. We are all treaty people. I'm grateful to live and work in the city of Toronto and to be sustained and nourished by the lands and waters. I offer my gratitude and my respect to the elders, past and present. The work of the Ecological Design Lab happens on the north shore of Lake Ontario, so some distance from the Missouri Basin, but connected by water, we might argue. Our work focuses on the connection between landscapes, infrastructure, and resilience. And in particular, as was noted in the introduction very generously, I'm interested in how we manifest these changes in our cities in particular, and more how they connect to our own health and well-being. Most of my published work and the work that I do in the kinds of sharing and advocacy work with the public really connects people to city and people to nature and cities. That's the easy way to say this. The work all focuses on ecological processes and connections to living, better living, and flourishing within cities. Most of this was inspired by the New Urban Agenda, and I point this out because in 2017 was the first time at the United Nations that Habitat 3, the conference that happens through the United Nations, focused on biodiversity. In other words, there was an explicit recognition that cities and biodiversity must coexist, and the connections between them have very much to do with our own health. For many of us working in the plant-based community and land-based practices, we understand this, but it is of course not the norm. And so this is a really important motivation for thinking across the disciplines and connecting through infrastructure, people to cities, and that means through the material processes of nature. So my research, that's essentially a simple question. How do we reconnect our cities to the nature that supports us? More specifically, from a science perspective, we're interested in the processes of ecology that link to resilience. How does resilience happen in living systems? And we know it happens with biodiversity. We know that biodiversity is instrumental in this, which then in turn means planning and designing to sustain and support biodiversity has very much to do with connections. And that's really the simple way of framing this. Most of the work is focused on a material design intervention. That is to say, things we make and we intervene in places with, blue and green infrastructure. Some people call these nature-based solutions. My European colleagues and most of the Canadian people I work with refer to these as nature-based solutions broadly in planning and design. But blue and green infrastructure specifically are those designed interventions, and you'll be familiar with them, things like gardens and yards, public parks. These slow, hold, and clean water. They create, connect, and protect habitat, and most importantly, they cultivate flourishing places, places where people and other species will thrive together. That's the goal. And right now, these three strategies, you might say, of infrastructure are very limited. We most often are familiar with the gray infrastructure, the roads, rails, bridges, pipelines, and highways, rather than an investment in critical living infrastructure that performs all of these functions, and most of all, is tied to our health and wellness. And this is part of a movement that is called the biophilic city movement. Biophilia, many of you will be familiar with as simply the love of nature. And this is an organization started by my colleague and friend Tim Beatley at the University of Virginia a long time ago now, but has expanded across the globe to include many partner cities. In North America, 14 partner cities to be specific. Cities that help to build the urban nature experience and to look at ways in which purpose-built or designed infrastructure from parks to gardens, green rooftops, bioswales, and green streets, all of which provide a place where the normal course of work and play that residents experience is rich in biodiversity or the living world. The partner cities worldwide are important because each of them are doing specific actions that engage with and create green infrastructures that provide a better quality of life. And we're gathering data to show how this works, as well as documenting success stories that others learn from. Most importantly in this work is to connect ourselves to the benefits that biodiversity or nature more broadly will provide. We know this through our own physical fitness and stimulation, being out in nature for walking and running or taking time to be outdoors for stress relief. But we also know there are good data showing a connection to shorter healing and recovery times, the lowering of our cortisol levels, and more recently, efforts that have focused on children's attention, particularly around learning and focus. I would also say an associative benefit that is being uncovered in more studies lately is one that shows compassion and empathy improving with 15 minutes of time spent in urban green vegetation. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean native biodiversity, but we know there's possibility there. More specifically, I would say that we have evidence showing that human social behaviors actually show a tendency to relax, show cohesiveness, lower aggression, improve social cohesion, all of which is exposed in urban nature, we could say broadly, but specifically within a radius of about 10 minutes from our homes. We also know that proximity matters, so the experience of nature, even through a window, makes a difference. In fact, the evidence is so compelling that we now have medical physicians prescribing outdoor time. So we would call this green time, social prescribing of green time rather than screen time. In Canada, you can get a prescription from your physician to take time outdoors in nature as a form of stress relief. Biophilic design, of course, offers many opportunities. Many of us will be familiar with these for children, especially if you're a person who is designing nature play habitats or you're a parent. We know that stargazing, urban farming, nature walking, forest bathing, these are all activities in which we engage our children specifically and ourselves as we age to take the benefits of nature, so to say. Nature play is one of the more developed aspects of biophilic design that we know is connected to better learning outcomes. And that goes along with this notion of green time away from the screens. In some of the work that we're doing, we're focusing on how to make space for biodiversity or for nature, but at the same time, how to create places with natural processes. So for and with biodiversity is important. Most of my work's been focused on public parks, and that is to say, public spaces over which the city has jurisdiction and governance. And there's lots of progress on public spaces for biodiversity and nature. Perhaps less energy has been spent to date on private yards, and that's where I really want to focus some of the learning in this particular talk. I'm going to share with you a particular set of examples from Toronto, one that begins with my own yard. And Toronto is a city on the North Shore of Lake Ontario that is self-proclaimed the city within a park. And you can see by this aerial view down one of the three major urbanized ravines and river systems that it does appear to be a green city, insofar as tree canopy is concerned. But we're also a lakeshore city, including a 10-kilometer spit into Lake Ontario that is entirely made from reclaimed material. This is literally the foundations of most of the financial towers in our nation's capital, and it has created a 10-kilometer spit, but it is not natural, it's designed, and at the same time, it supports a wide range of native biodiversity and provides recreation for citizens in the city. I show this image because it shares with you that the city is one of water and land, and the relationship between them is important. Just for context, for those of you joining us from across North America, this is Canada's fastest growing region from a population perspective. So we are the economic heartland of the country, not the capital, but certainly the most populous. And our population will double from 5 million to 10 million by 2045 based on current projections. And this is important because we are one of the southernmost cities sharing a border with the US, and all of our biodiversity is along that southern border. Lots of wild places in the country, but the richest biodiversity is in the south. So on a collision course with urbanization, urban expansion, and of course, competition for agriculture. Toronto recently became a member of the Biophilic Cities Network. I was really happy to work on that application with city staff. And the reason we did this was to share some of the policy and design work we've been doing to protect biodiversity, support, and enhance nature in the city, particularly on public lands. And that, in many respects, is a good thing. We pioneered some of the first bird-friendly or bird-safe architecture, bird-friendly development guidelines in North America. We created a ravine strategy that protects our watersheds, 3 major watercourses that flow from headlands into Lake Ontario, including the Canada's largest urbanized watershed for the Don River of 365 square kilometers. So this is an important infrastructural component in our city. We also created a pollinator protection strategy. I say we because I serve on the advisory committees for some of these city committees that are focused on urban nature or building support for biodiversity. Most recently, the biodiversity strategy for the city, which encompasses a number of other policies and plans. And the focus in this here, this image from the islands just outside, well, on the doorstep of the city, really emphasize the wild, connected, and diverse qualities of the biodiversity in the city. This included the creation by city staff of a series of 12 guidebooks. So everything from the birds to spiders to butterflies and fishes. These are free for download for anyone who wants to learn about the biodiversity of the city. And this is an important public outreach exercise in this respect. My own university at Toronto Metropolitan has the first commercial urban farm in the city. Every year, 8,000 pounds of food are grown, produced, and shared with the student and local community. And this green roof is the result of North America's first green roof bylaw. What we call bylaws, some of you will call zoning codes, but these are ordinances or requirements in city policy that now require in the city of Toronto every commercial institutional facility of over more than 2,000 square meters must have a green roof. And we have to date more than 700 green roofs built and installed in the city. There are many other cities that are doing this as well. Of course, Chicago being an excellent example, Montreal, Vancouver, and certainly in California we see them too, although with a different emphasis. Here we're talking about food production and using these spaces for native biodiversity for pollination, but also the production of agricultural crops. Our city also has a green streets policy. This all sounds very positive, doesn't it? Moving from roads, rails, and bridges and gray infrastructure to a thick, green, lush living infrastructure is part of the fabric of our city now, including bioswales and forms of irrigation. Examples from Portland and Philadelphia were used to help inspire those in Toronto in a colder climate, but nevertheless holding, slowing, and soaking water. Vancouver, the city in which I'm sitting today, has a pilot project now that is creating native grasses and wildflower meadows in most of its city parks, all 18 in fact. So these together suggest to us that the future is green. Or is it? In fact, I'd say not so much. The future may, in fact, still be gray. And the reason I'm emphasizing this right now is because there's a major barrier across all North American cities, and it lies in something fairly benign and humble on the surface, but very powerful and arguably anything but benign underneath. And that's the municipal code. Almost every city has one. It's usually referred to as a property standards ordinance, or sometimes it's called public nuisance ordinance. Ours is called, in the municipal code, chapter 489, is called the grass and weeds ordinance, or in our world, the municipal code bylaw. And this has various chapters. Without getting into too much of the, forgive the pun, of the weeds of the weed code, it really has to do with enforcing people to cut any green vegetation to a level of 20 centimeters or 8 inches. This means that fundamentally, every city has a piece of legislation that requires a lawn. So let's have a look at the lawn for a moment. This is of course an entire field of study, and many of you will be very familiar with this, but it's worth spending just a moment to recast our gaze and to look at the lawn as a matter of more than grass. It is a monoculture. It's about order, control, stability, and most of all about power. In this wonderful book that was written by the late Diana Balmori, together with Herbert Borman and Gordon Gabal, Diana Balmori, of course, a landscape architect, they wrote this book a long time ago now, in 1993, redesigning the American lawn, and they pointed out very lucidly and articulately in this work the ways in which the lawn was environmentally destructive homogenizing of the very biodiversity that most of you here at this conference today seek to support. The New York Times did a wonderful video actually on the Great American Lawn, and they talk about the association of the lawn as a symbol of luxury, order, power, and stability against the backdrop of urbanizing America. And of course, this feature really looks at the emphasis on home ownership, and with it, racializing communities and maintaining them in a way that has contributed to social division and now, of course, to climate change. So this history is an important part of understanding its embeddedness in what we call our property standards ordinances. And of course, the lawn itself. I love this rather poetic statement by F.J. Scott from The Art of Beautifying Suburban Home Grounds, 1870. A smooth, closely shaven surface of green is by far the most essential element of beauty on the grounds of a suburban house. Well, is it 1870 anymore? Today, lawns are the largest crop in the United States of America. You have more than 40 million acres or 63,000 square miles of lawn in the country. I mean, it's the largest crop, actually. Think about that for a minute. Requiring more than 200 gallons of water per person. Lots of Californians have been engaging in the hashtag drought shame for good reason, and raising awareness and recognition of the need for xeriscaping or dry gardening. This is well established, but perhaps less known is how much money is spent on a very powerful industry, almost $100 billion spent on lawn and garden care, emphasis on the lawn. And of course, that comes with it, this image, the cultivated image of freedom, luxury, and privilege. And one only has to do a short Google search of images that relate to the lawn, and we can see how the language is carried forward. A man's turf, the perfect lawn, emphasizing perfection, order, monotony, some would say, monoculture for sure, and of course the time, the tyranny of time spent on the lawnmower, the money poured into pesticides and herbicides, and of course, what do we do with that? One of the first things we do is attack that image of childhood freedom, the dandelion, otherwise known in many ordinances as a weed. Of course, you could skip all that. My neighbor, when I lived in New Zealand, decided it wasn't worth any time at all and simply put down astroturf. Perhaps it doubles as a parking pad. What lawns say to us, though, is much more than the words we use to describe them. They're deeply embedded in histories of colonialism and environmental destruction alike. These are twin crises that sit before us today, climate change and the extinction abyss. When we picture this image of the American dream, we probably see something that is so embedded in our consciousness it's hard to separate, hence being embedded in the codes of practice in our municipalities. Some would say that the history of the lawn is powerfully connected to control over nature. In fact, John Douglas Belshaw, a professor colleague at Thompson Rivers University here in the west coast of Canada, has written a lovely piece for our national newspaper on settler values. The idea that settler culture is rooted in order and control of the monoculture of the lawn. He says, a backyard with a big lawn is like a classroom for colonialism and environmental hostility. And he's not far wrong. Because meanwhile, back in Toronto, I promised you I'd get back to my own city. A storm was brewing in the meadow, and not just any meadow, but my meadow. I told you before that Toronto has recognized itself as the city within a park, but what about the yards? And this was my introduction to moving my practice from the public realm into the private in a way that was a little bit uncomfortable. My house is in an affluent part of the city. I'm a university professor. I'm privileged to own a corner lot. Zooming down from the sky here in the center of Midtown West, my lot is this yellow house built in the 1920s with a patio and a rather formally designed backyard, actually. But the front yard's a little different. We're on a steep slope, approaching a 20% grade in one part. And we decided that the most reasonable, logical thing anyone could do would be to rewild it because it's a steep slope and the runoff and erosion are difficult. And certainly no one wants to push a mower up a hill, not me. And my own work in native plants seemed a reasonable place, a testing ground, if you will, for what we could do with an urban meadow. And we got endorsement and friendships from the Canadian pollinators organizations like Project Swallowtail and Carolinian Canada. Our versions of many of the organizations you thanked at the beginning of this presentation are involved in supporting community-engaged projects around lawns and turning lawns into meadows. In my case, these were fruit trees that I'd inherited, and there were also some oak trees, which are part of an oak savanna ecosystem endemic to this region. But those have to be maintained, and they're maintained by cutting or burning. And in my case, selective weed pulling or identification of which plants I didn't want. That was my definition of the weeds that got pulled, none of which are in the foreground. Everything from Canada's sea oats, ryegrasses, various species of goldenrod or solidago species, New England asters of various descriptions, all were welcome in this space, including our own native staghorn and smooth sumac. It is not Allianthus, I promise. But we do have some visitors. There's a katsura tree, for example, in the foreground you'll see. So we weren't doctrinaire about which plants to include, but rather that they hold, slow, and soak water, and they provide pollination benefit, cover for migratory birds. We're in the heart of the North American flyway. Milkweed as a host plant for monarch butterflies. And the beautiful pairing, as Robin Wall Kimmerer has so poetically written about, between asters and goldenrod, helping us to see that beautiful color combination photochemically with our eyes and the color reflections, but also in the way the bees see that combination, calling them to pollinate. We planted for fall color. We planted for regeneration and resilience. And we allowed our meadow to flourish. But as it turned out, it was all too wild for the Hillcrest neighborhood. It was too messy, too weedy, and apparently too much, because on August 25th of 2020, I found myself in possession of a violation notice. You can't imagine my young son's surprise when he answered the door and was asked by the municipal licensing and standards enforcement officer to speak to his mother. He did ask her if she was sure she wanted to do that, and it did provide an amazing opportunity to dig deep into the municipal codes of practice, which inevitably are the barriers to biodiversity. It turned out I wasn't the first person. In fact, natural gardens have a long history of violations, both of violations against the lawn and violations of support for biodiversity. And the violators are the native gardeners. Beginning in Toronto with Sandy Bell's garden back in 1994, she was charged a $50 fine because the inspector said her yard was excessively too high. It was overgrown and messy. Sandy Bell called this an environmentally sound garden that supported biodiversity. These images are from my good friend and colleague Lorraine Johnson, who worked with Sandy Bell. And Sandy Bell ended up going to court and setting a precedent. And I'll tell you about that later. It's important, and I'll come back to it. In 2019, Douglas Counter, another good friend and supporter of native gardening, had his lawn raised, a lawn that he planted lovingly in memory of his mother. And he was informed that he should be advised that an inspection was conducted and the property was indeed in violation for plants that exceeded 20 centimeters or 8 inches in height. No one told the asters. Marion Mutton's Coburg garden, same thing. This was raised not once, not twice, but 3 times by the city officials in Coburg, who decided it was too wild, too messy, and too much. You can see the afterwards is perhaps a lot less desirable. The city of Burlington ordered Doreen Nickel to remove her milkweed plants. Milkweed are not on any noxious weed list. They're the only host plant for monarchs, and recently our mayor declared August to be the month of the monarch. Meanwhile, removing milkweed from people's lawns. A Windsor home out here devastated as his sunflowers were cut down, sunflowers he planted with his daughter. How old was she? She was 6. No one told her the sunflowers were too tall. We took to social media when this happened to me. I'm obviously a person who's working in this field, and they targeted someone for whom this was really a gift. I asked people if they like this meadow. Well, the city of Toronto didn't. And soon afterwards, there erupted a storm of media interest. Perhaps it was the right time, or maybe I was the wrong person in the right spot. But in any case, this became a media storm. And we had a number of headlines immediately. And what was so interesting to me, first and foremost, was that the story that broke in our national paper was written by an architecture critic. How great is that? An architecture critic picked up a story about a wild garden. And I thank Alex Bezikovich for the headline, Law and Order. That's his title. We also wrote an op-ed together with my good friend Lorraine Johnson. We provided an op-ed in our local paper to emphasize the irony where our city of Toronto puts so much energy into green infrastructure on public lands and yet chastises individual property owners for doing the same thing in their private yards. Next thing that happened, another really interesting moment. The article was picked up again by the national paper, but with under the column Indigenous Rights. And this heading that seems so ironic, the humble garden could be under threat. Really? It's humble? In what way is it humble? Within a few minutes of people saying those very comments, the title changed and the headline changed to "Is it time to decolonize your lawn?" Same article, same message, different headline. So you can see that there was a lot of co-learning happening along the way with these stories. I also got love letters for the meadow. One thing that, yes, there was a lot of hate mail, a lot of trolls, and people calling the yard lazy and neglected, but there was fan mail. Dear friends, we like your garden. It radiates care and love. Lots of handwritten notes, but really a groundswell of a public uprising to say this is not okay. We're sitting on the edge of climate change and on the edge of an extinction. We need to do something on our own private merits, however small or humble they might be. Engaged Donnelly Law, a good friend and colleague, David Donnelly, well-known environmental lawyer, who immediately wrote the cease and desist. And what he focused on was the precedent set by Sands Garden. Bear with me because it's worth explaining that Ontario, the province of Ontario, where I work and live, the Ontario Superior Court ruled in Sandy Bell to say specifically the constitutional right, we call them charter rights, but these are constitutional right to express one's environmental values is allowed on your own property. That's a huge statement. And for they were able to charge the city back to say, there are 3 huge problems with my violation order, one of which is it's vague. There are no definitions given. Of the 12,000 species of graminoids, which are the grasses? Which plants are the weeds? What plants are offending? And of course, the bylaw officers could never identify any plants because that's not what they're trained in. So the vague quality makes it effectively unenforceable. And worse yet, the subjective and unscientific terms of overgrown, messy, nuisance, untidy, disorderly, these are subjective qualities that relate to appearance, not to science. What were the harms that were being done by these plants? And so for these reasons, we made a compelling 6-page argument that the bylaw was not valid, that the enforcement was arbitrary. It's only people who complain. And there could be lawns on either side of mine that had turned to meadows in a different aesthetic, and yet they wouldn't be cut. So we argued that the legal precedent that had already been set is that the zoning bylaw is unconstitutional. The city cannot regulate based on aesthetics. That's really important. But what we discovered in this dispute, asking what's up, Buttercup, with a tongue in the cheek perhaps, but in a very serious way, we asked the question, what is the health and safety risk about this garden? What are the health and safety risks happening? And we never got a satisfactory answer. And while I was called lazy and the space was called neglected, really, we asked questions back in a way that was quite provocative. We decided it was worth it to go to City Hall to say, you can't regulate aesthetics. And we invited the mayor to tea. The mayor is in the red mask in the center. My lawyer is to his viewer's right. And my family and I argued strenuously that this was a place of education, community, and compassion, pollination, support for biodiversity. It also, of course, unsurprisingly, launched a 2-year research program with my wonderful graduate students in how to advance natural gardens and native plants in our cities. In other words, much of the work that you all are doing, we did as well. And we started by really understanding the nature and extent of the bylaws across North America. We did point out multiple times that the Ontario Superior Court ruled in 1996 that citizens have the right to express their environmental values in their gardens. The city has policies to support biodiversity, so requiring an exemption or enforcing a cut order to do the very same thing on our private yard is silly, and fining us to do so is ridiculous. We created a bylaw for biodiversity, a model bylaw. That's the natural thing a group of planners would do, rewrite the bylaw. My student Carly Murphy, who has since graduated and is now a planner in a neighboring town, wrote a lovely bylaw that is very simple in its beauty. It removed any reference to height, removed any reference to turf grass, and focused instead on linking to prohibited plants that had deleterious health risks to humans, poison ivy, for example, and giant hogweed, for example, and it's also plants that were environmentally or ecologically dangerous. So we would call these the really aggressive invasive. So in our area, dog strangling vine or kudzu might be examples. We also undertook in 2 years a support that rather a study of 14 cities across North America with our partners at Biophilic Cities Network. And we created a toolkit that anyone can download, which is on the Ecological Design website. And it looks at these 14 cities in North America and how ways in which planners could change their bylaws to support biodiversity on private lands. We also looked at private-public partnerships, but specifically private yards. I'll summarize quite quickly to say that the code analysis, if you like, the way in which we looked at these 14 cities and their municipal codes that relate to property standards, there were many takeaways, but three that I'd like to highlight here. One is that the height limits and that restrictions on height are universally common. Virtually every city, every municipality has an ordinance that somewhere talks about maintaining height. When they do this, though, they don't often specify which plants and why, and they certainly don't substantiate those with reference to risk. Here's a lovely ornamental garden. Should it be mowed down? Where in the bylaw does it say that a plant should be 8 inches? Well, it says with reference to grass. These are grasses. So there are all kinds of disjunctures, contradictions, and of course, impossibilities for equitable enforcement that arise out of a bylaw that is so vaguely worded. Very few bylaws define what a weed is. They certainly don't relate them back to noxious weed acts or weed control acts. Certainly in farming communities like yours, where this conference is hosted, there are rural communities that have very specific ordinances about plants that should be prohibited because they are destructive to crops, for example. We can debate the role of those in the city, but most cities can at least point to the most egregious plants and refer specifically and scientifically to them using evidence. We also found that all the definitions for weeds, lawns, and gardens leave compliance up to interpretation, and that's because they're so vague. What is a grass? What is a weed? What is an offending plant? What is a nuisance? What do you mean by vermin? What is a pest? Unless these words are defended and defined with evidence, there's no possibility of enforcement that makes any sense at all, and certainly not equitable enforcement. So we could look at these images and use some of the words that we pulled from the municipal codes across these 14 cities. Are these a visual blight, or are they beautiful? Are they unkempt, messy, or naturalized and biodiverse, for example? The third takeaway from this work was that code justifications are often problematic, and what we found is that in being problematic, they contradict the sustainability objectives of the very same cities that are doing good work on their public lands. So many times I argued that what is happening on the left hand with public policy and biodiversity policy and all these terrific emphases on green infrastructure and connecting people to nature in our public spaces is completely contradicted by the right hand of control on the private owner's yard. Why punish an individual property owner for doing the simplest, smallest thing they can on their front doorstep? Why? This makes no sense at all, and something that for us was a key nut to crack, if you will, in the biodiversity barriers. Oftentimes, aesthetics are used as justification for these vague and arbitrary bylaws. Noxious weeds, for example, this comes from St. Louis, Missouri. I hope you'll find this interesting. Noxious weeds, which have attained a height of 7 inches or more, growing or being upon any lot within the city, and unattended, does that mean you have to stand and watch? I'm not sure. Unattended growth of shrubs, trees, and seedlings, which in the opinion of the Commissioner of Forestry are unsightly. So one person is going to decide whether your shrub, tree, or seedling is unsightly. Good luck standing up in court. You know, we really struggled with this on reading these examples, and we have dozens of them that really show where the words public nuisance, unsightly, unkempt, visual blight, messy are used in a law, in a zoning ordinance, which is a piece of legislation that is defendable in court. So it's hard to believe how these have persisted for so long unless we look back in history at the origins of the law and understand that it was simply a cultural norm whose time has changed. The other justification we hear about is for health and safety, and those are justifiable when they have evidence to support them. But using terms here from the Washington, D.C.'s ordinance, like serious public health implication, without defining what that is, and worse yet, linking weeds, undefined, weeds that create a breeding place for vermin. Vermin are listed here, mosquitoes, rats, mice, and snakes, but of course, many of us will recognize that our healthy, thick, biodiverse yards may have mosquitoes, but they equally have other species which prey upon these. We hear the argument about ticks a lot. We know that while ticks are everywhere and they're not usually in a monocultural lawn, they are significantly reduced in terms of their impact when biodiversity in the whole ecosystem is encouraged. So we really need to take a more balanced approach to this. And you'll notice that whenever we use terms like weed overgrowth as a justification, that's a red flag for you to be looking at what are demonstrable ecological health and personal safety risks. That's where we can actually define what they are. For example, a visual sight line at a corner. So, to sum this up, what did all this work that came out of my violation notice lead to? Well, most importantly, leading it to the revision of the Toronto bylaw was the first outcome, and some recommendations in that process that I'd like to highlight, which could be useful for most of you working to advocate for native plants in your municipalities. The most important for us was to remove an exemption for a natural garden. Toronto had a very strange code that allowed you to have a natural garden, but you had to prove it was natural without any definition, and you had to apply for a permit to grow a native garden. We found that both egregious, misinformed, and outdated. We argue that biodiversity is normal. It's not an exception. It's not an aberration. Mind you, that bylaw was written in 1996 after the Sandy Bell decision, so there may be some understanding of the time lag, and arguably it was a cultural moment when that bylaw was written. So we were successful in removing the exemption. We asked them to remove any reference to turf grass entirely because lawns are no longer the norm, but rather they are one of many possible aesthetics to pursue in private and public garden design. We asked for removal to any height reference, that there's no need to mow, only grow. We wanted all control, any restriction of control focused only on ecological and human health and safety. So in other words, regulate with evidence, not aesthetics or appearance. So if something's a health hazard for a driver's vision, then say so. We asked them to consult widely and deeply with our Indigenous community members because we created a prohibited plants list, and we had to be certain that our Indigenous community members agreed with us as to what plants ought to be under control. For example, the Ontario Noxious Weed Act for a long time had burdock, common burdock in that. We know that that is a medicinal plant used in Indigenous ceremony and for healing. So we wanted to understand that this prohibited plant list had to be lean, and it should be restricted to the most invasive plants that have a very distinctive ecological health risk. And finally, I'd say that we really wanted enforcement to change. Absolutely encourage your municipalities to track enforcement, measure and analyze the socioeconomic and racial inequities they may come from enforcement. Where are the complaints happening and who's enforcing on which yards, particularly for marginalized communities where they're growing food in their front gardens, for example. We have asked that the burden of proof be reversed. The complainants must ID the problem plants. No raising of yards, and you must define what is the problem plant when you call in a complaint. That has not yet happened. So to summarize the result, we now have a new bylaw. It's called the Turf Grass and Prohibited Plants Bylaw, not the Weeds and Grass Bylaw. We had a revised bylaw that we worked on, presented in May of 2021. It was amended and approved, and now it's in effect. It's been in effect all year, and we are monitoring enforcement to see whether the problems have ameliorated or whether we're getting different problems emerging with this new bylaw. It may well be that people are inadvertently growing some prohibited plants, for example, so we know that education and outreach are critical. People are still allowed to grow turf grass, but it's defined and it can be mowed. So that's the compromise, you might say, in what we achieved. But this has not changed things in some ways. Outlying municipalities in our area are still suffering complaints. The good news is the education and outreach campaign that we launched through my violation and through others that felt more comfortable perhaps in relating theirs. This has led to a groundswell of uprising among the pollinator supportive community, the native plant movement, ecological design more broadly, and landscape architecture more broadly still. We have a public outpouring of support for folks like Susan McKee, who came home from a holiday to find her entire yard raised. And these are very emotional experiences for people. We're very connected to the energy and time and compassion and love we put into our gardens. To find them force mowed is a horrible and egregious act of violence, not only against the biodiversity, but against the person who's put this time into their yard. So when the city enacts an enforcement, a draconian regime like this, it is time for intervention. We've seen two national organizations take on these cases now with support from my lab and from my colleagues like Lorraine Johnson and David Donnelly, but it's not enough. We need more, and we need wide-scale change. If we are constitutionally allowed to do this, we need every municipality to be forced to bring their code up to code. A better story is the case of Smiths Falls, a very small rural community north of Toronto, south of Ottawa, in the Canadian Shield. This is a beautiful native garden with habitat logs placed by a couple, both Bethany and Craig Sinclair and their daughter have created this yard as a form of healing and reconciliation. They've planted more than 150 trees, and the town of Smiths Falls decided they should remove it because it was messy, untidy, and in particular, the habitat logs were deemed waste, garbage on the lawn. So we went to court on this case, and I'm really pleased to say we won. We have actually forced the town of Smiths Falls to revisit and redesign its approach to managing property standards. So this is what can happen when a committed group of people work together with support. A win like this is just one more in the fight to ensure that we get to protect biodiversity. So next up on the challenge list, well, many of you will be familiar with this, perhaps we'll be taking on the leaf blower battles that are emerging in the city of Toronto. We'd like to be like Washington, which has actually placed a ban on leaf blowers at a particular decibel level. So there's a lot to be said about how to protect biodiversity, one battle at a time. For those of you who are interested in these resources, I really encourage you to have a look at the Ecological Design Lab, and please download our toolkits. They're free for anyone who wants them, and they're not just Canadian-centric. There are 14 partner cities in the Biophilic Cities Network with whom we partnered, and all of them are included in this study and the toolkit. I'd also encourage you to have a look at Lorraine Johnson's lovely new work, A Garden for the Rusty Patched Bumblebee. She's done some beautiful books on creating habitat for native pollinators. I've also put some links in the chat for you. If they're not in the chat, forgive me, they're certainly available on the platform, including a wonderful podcast that I had the chance to do with Jennifer Welsh at the Biophilic Cities Solutions podcast series. All of this to say is it does take individual property owners standing up, and when you've got time and privilege, it's certainly easier, but don't be afraid. There's a warrior in every one of us, and our biodiversity and our gardens need it. Thanks so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I look forward to your questions.
That was phenomenal. Thank you so much. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. If you don't mind, we can address those now before we head into office hours in just a few minutes. Okay, so Tammy asks, have your court case successes changed the way property inspectors are addressing lawns and violations?
Great question, Tammy. That's really the missing middle of this argument. Enforcement, of course, these officers who do property standards enforcement across every municipality are trained to respond to all manner of complaints. So it could be a party going on past midnight, it could be dogs off a leash, it could be illegal parking. So really their portfolios are huge. And I don't hold individual officers accountable in any way for the badly written bylaws they're asked to enforce. I would say that our biggest success, if I could call it that, or perhaps the greatest inroad we're making, is working together with the City of Toronto because we have a champion on the inside. There's a wonderful person in the bylaw office who is herself a native plant specialist. And Patricia Landry has been working to educate and advocate for native gardens for the last 20 years. In fact, she was the person who issued the exemption permits and made sure virtually anyone who wanted one could get these permits before we had them removed. The problem was people didn't know about them, and the bylaw enforcement officers did not know how to recognize as plants as being under the exemption for native gardens list or not, because they had no plant training skills. So now the inroads are all on education. Part of the bylaw revision included budget implication to train, educate, and support enforcement officers' understanding of native plants. Now, they're not ever going to be native plant specialists, and nor should they be, but we must have a bylaw that is general enough and specific enough that anyone should be able to have a picture card ID and understand whether a bull thistle or a Canada thistle or, it is on that list or not, for example. So there's progress that is slow, but that's really a place to apply pressure. Is education has to happen from within enforcement. It also compels the people who are writing bylaws to understand more specifically what kind of training is needed. If you're going to put scientific definitions in, then you've got to have people who understand what they mean in practice.
Absolutely. That's really interesting, and I love that they budgeted for it, and I'm hoping that also means, like a refresher course every year because of staff attrition, a deeper understanding of what's going on in your specific community. So that's I'm really inspired by that. Early in the days of Deep Roots, before I came on, I know that we did a training for some city inspectors, but that was more than 5 years ago at this point. So I really do. I'm embracing the idea of ongoing education. I
Yeah,
mean,
and
also,
the
oh,
details
sorry.
are so I was gonna say the details are really in the meadow. They are in the deep roots because it is never the same people who write the bylaw, and then it goes through legal for a check, and then people to enforce it. There's sometimes a chasm between them. So it's a really critical place to apply both pressure and funding.
I recently, or actually, am continuing to participate on a committee in our community looking to rewrite some of these codes. And in one of our discussions, one of the members pointed out that sometimes befriending your neighbors is one of the most important things you can do, because every once in a while you'll have a neighbor who is just feeling a little vindictive, so they call codes when you just have a lovely native plant landscape.
Yeah,
So Tammy,
we had tours of our garden, for example. We have a very well-known landscape architect living right across the road from us, Janet Rosenberg, who, while she practices with a very different aesthetic, was a huge champion in helping us educate and advocate in the neighborhood. We'd put little sort of toadstool tree stumps down by the corner for children used to sit on them all the time. We ended up having to put um, a brush pile there to encourage rabbit habitat because the kids were so happy to see them. But the education piece is really huge. I see there's another question on that same thread.
there is. Yeah. So do you find interpretive signage to be helpful with neighborhood education and reduction in complaints?
Well, anecdotally, yes, people will stop and talk to you. They'll ask about it. But those, let's just say the haters are always there. We've had our signs ripped out and violated several times. The signs have been vandalized, or stolen. And we find that really the better way is to talk to your neighbor. However, there are some neighborhoods that just feel that their property values are affected by your messy or untidy or unkempt yard. And that's a really an important point also to advocate for the self, actually. The community, yes, but the self, that you have the right to protect biodiversity. And if your neighborhood's aesthetic is one that's different, it is going to be an uphill battle. The friendliness does matter. But at the same time, we need support from legislation. I would also just put my oar in to say that in our very, very ethnoculturally diverse cities, we have to be mindful about who has the capacity to take this on. I certainly had everything. I had privilege, capacity, wealth. And I would argue that as a public servant, it was my obligation to take on this case and to use it in the way that I have. But there are many what we call priority neighborhoods or communities that are racialized, that are socioeconomically depressed, that have people who may be growing shared yards for food provision. If we find enforcement happening there, and no amount of talking to neighbors is going to change that, that is a targeted effort. And that's the reason that I say our emphasis on tracking enforcement from an equity perspective, your ombudsperson can help you with that. Most cities do track where permits and enforcements are issued, and I would encourage you to make that public and look for any overlap that is disturbingly racialized.
That is an excellent point. Thank you very much. Carla asks, any experience with home and neighborhood associations? Usually the covenants are more restrictive.
That's an excellent question, and it's one that I don't have very much experience with. We don't have a lot of these in the Canadian context. I mean, they are emerging, but we don't have gated communities or covenants in quite the same way. My students looked at this in the toolkit with several of the biophilic partner cities where covenants were raised. And we took the same approach to the covenants that we did with zoning ordinances or bylaws, municipal codes, in that we found what we wanted to do was a combination of education, advocacy, and outreach to help people understand that regulating aesthetics is actually not legal, not in most places. So that's a big battle to fight, and it's one that will probably be fought in the courts and not over the fences.
I was really blown away early in your presentation talking about the control, the ordinances are in place to tell people what to do, and it really brought home to me just what we're sort of fighting against right now. I have one last question before we go into office hours, and that's from Chris. He says, was there a data gathering process to arrive at the prohibited plants list? It seems quite short and missing things like ailanthus and winter creeper.
Yes, and of course, most important to say they are regionally and contextually specific. Ours, we took an easy way to do it, not necessarily the best way, but it's the first step, and that is to link it to an already existing piece of legislation, which is the Noxious Weeds Act. It's an Ontario regulation that lists 25 species, and we shortened it to 10. Those that were not on it are not the ones you mentioned. They're not ailanthus and winter creeper. In part, we could say that those lists have a strong implication for the nursery trade. Let me just say that even getting the lawn care organizations to support us was huge. It was actually monumental that we got the Landscape Association of Ontario to sign a letter of support for us. Why? Because rather than attack nursery plants that might be escaping and causing some of the problems, we chose to focus on the ecological and ecosystem benefits of a naturalized yard that Landscape Ontario and their tradespeople could see as an economic opportunity and a sort of green economy benefit for them. That was our approach. It was one that was really about low-hanging fruit. The data gathering portion is in the works, and that has to be done in tandem with Indigenous communities, which in our area are treaty holders. And for us, that means finding out which plants have spiritual, medicinal, or culturally significant value. And we could say that for other ethnocultural groups in our city too, which is incredibly diverse. And we find that that is going to take some time. The list should be short, I would argue, not long. Many of you will have strong feelings about nursery plants that should long ago have been regulated, as the two that you've suggested. But that's the next level, I think, of understanding how we regulate. We're starting with plants that have a place in legislation already because they are simply easier to regulate.
I know in the state of Kansas, the noxious weed list is almost entirely focused on agriculture and the
Yes.
impact on farming and livestock. And is Ontario the same?
Yes, exactly so. And that's why I say it's far from perfect, but it's a good first step. I mean, the reality is half the plants on the Ontario list you wouldn't find in the urban area anyway. The other half that you would have ecological and human health and safety risks. I mentioned the easy ones like poison ivy or giant hogweed, for example. These are known to have risks, and that's easy enough to point out. If there's just a risk to cattle, they're not really a risk in the city, so we leave them off the list. We also leave off those that have, as I say, Indigenous and cultural significance.
That makes sense. And agreed, you do have to start somewhere. Otherwise, what is it? My colleague Tammy says, perfection is the opposite of done. So like you have to get
the opposite of done.
along the way. Perfect.
Absolutely.
Well, we are approaching the top of the hour, and I would like to say thank you, Nina Marie. This was really inspiring and interesting, and I know I will be able to bring back a lot of what I learned today to that committee that I'm working on. So to our audience, don't forget, her office hours are immediately following this keynote. And with this, our 2022 Planet Native Conference is drawing to a close. Thank you for joining us, and many thanks to our sponsors, volunteers, and speakers. We look forward to seeing you next year, whatever that looks like. And until then, please welcome back to the stage, nobody. I'm sorry, bad notes. It's a good thing that I talk to myself all the time, because, right? Because when I just kind of sort of ad lib, it's kind of what I do when I'm walking around my house. So thank you, everyone, for joining Planet Native 2022. We'll see you at the office hours following next. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you.